Good morning, afternoon, depending on where you're dialing with us from. Today is the third webinar in our fall/winter webinar series on data and AI, making your data available to AI. I'm your host, Colin Miller, on behalf of the Catalyte team, along with our featured panelists, Chris Sorel, Murray, Ray, and Jeff Schmidt, who comprise the senior members of our AI and innovation practice here at Catalyte. Today, they'll be sharing a few examples and key takeaways around how to leverage your data effectively and making it available to AI, along with some interactive examples of how their team is currently using certain skills and technologies in their everyday practice. But without any further ado, we'd love to jump in. I'd like to highlight for everyone that we do have a Q&A portion at the end of today's session. So feel free to use the Q&A feature to share any questions you might have. We'll try and sprinkle them in transition through each section of today's presentation, as well as address any at the end. But with that, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody. And welcome to the third in our series, as Colin mentioned. So last time we talked about making your data ready for AI. And this time we're talking about making it available to AI. And these are obviously very interrelated topics, but they're distinct in the sense that you can make your data available, but it's not ready. And similarly, you can make it ready, but it's not available. And so, we're going to just kind of look at what it means to make it available and how here as we move through this series or this presentation. So I guess we'll kind of start with the maybe an obvious question, which is, why does data availability matter? And this is true, not just for AI, but for any of your systems. Why are you keeping the data if you're not using it? But I think it's important to understand that why it matters for AI is that the more information, the more context you can provide to a model, the better it does. And the less likely it is to hallucinate, the more able it is to give you good answers. And so, narrative, relying on people's memory or interacting with a chatbot is not going to be as helpful as having hard data that either is available for symbolic reasoning or for semantic querying. And so if you want to get, of course, business value out of your AI investment, it has to operate on your data. And it needs to be fast, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be in a delivery format that is easily accessible to AI systems. And I think this becomes increasingly important with agentic AI, where you may not have a human in the loop in some of these decisions, and you need to be able to make data available in a way that an agent can, by inference, understand what data they need and what to do with that data. So obviously that's why it's important here. And we've always sort of relied on this idea that, well, we can always get the data out into a CSV, and that's kind of true. But again, for that might be useful for interacting with ChatGPT or Copilot, but it's probably not going to be useful for any kind of sophisticated agentic use case or any type of use case with a chatbot or engagement with your customers. And then that, what does it really mean to say available? So right data, right time, the right context, and the right guardrails. And each of these is equally important. The right data, is the data fresh and available? Is it the correct data? And is it limited to only the data that you need? And we've talked about in the past that if you expose too much data, there's greater risk of hallucination, there's greater risk of exfiltration. And so we've talked about walled gardens and taking an approach where you have the minimal or the optimal set of data for your use cases, and no more than that and no less. The right time, of course, both in terms of its availability to the AI, but also in terms of the freshness of the data. So given your use case, you might need real-time data, or it might be that a month's old data is sufficient. And so you certainly have to understand that and make sure that the back end that's serving your data is providing it within the right window. And then the context is really going to be about that structure and that format. And we'll look at that later in the presentation where we've got a bit of a demo where the context matters. And you'll see that if you just throw random data that's poorly defined in terms of the schema and things like that, you're not going to get as good of results as if you have really good semantic labeling and associative graph or other types of associative context for it. And then, the right guardrails isn't about governance in terms of preventing data exfiltration, but it's also about how you control the agent to use the data. So just making the data available doesn't mean that the agent is going to use it or use it correctly. And it becomes really important to look into how can we engineer prompts, how can we use other sort of contextual structures to ensure that not only has the data it needs, but that it exclusively uses that data. Because it's, most of the really high profile failures we've seen, like putting rocks on pizza, are because the data wasn't constrained to a useful set and it picked something up from, Reddit or Facebook or something and used that as useful information. And so that those guardrails is really about constraining the agents to be able to use the right data. So that's kind of my side of it. Now we're going to just let Jeff talk a little bit here about some of the technologies around that and how they can enable availability.
Great, thanks, Chris. The plumbing technologies that turn stored data into accessible intelligence can be thought of really in two terms: supply and availability. Let's start with supply, because if the data ain't flowing, nothing else works. Data pipelines represent the distribution network of modern data solutions. And the OG of data movement is the much lauded ETL, the extract, transform, and load. But there's a new kid on the block named ELT, that is extract, surprisingly, load, and transform. And this shift may seem like it's a small, subtle one, but it's actually significant for AI workloads. And that's because the raw data is not lost during the transformation step. That is to say that the context of that data is preserved, and very important for AI solutions. With this data movement occurring, the destination becomes important, and that's the realm of unified storage platforms. We think here about data warehouses, lakes, data lakehouses act as the major holding tanks or repositories of that data. Now, making data available is the other part of the equation. So in terms of availability, we're talking here about APIs and microservices, as well as streaming and event-driven systems. Now, APIs like REST and GraphQL make the data a product. It becomes something that can be requested on demand. And while APIs make that data available on demand, streaming and event-driven systems make it available in real time. Now, these supply and availability technologies give us movement, but AI needs meaning, and so much meaning actually comes from context. Think about this. If I were to say to you, I think something's wrong with my keys again. If you were a homeowner, you might be thinking, I'm talking about my house keys. If you're my daughter, you might be thinking about car keys. A musician, piano keys. A programmer, keyboard keys. The importance of context, this context can't be overstated. And it's exactly why Model Context Protocol, or MCP, is getting so much attention these days. Context is indeed king. And AI native storage is where that king lives. So what I mean by in order to talk about AI native storage, we need to first talk about semantic versus symbolic reasoning. Semantic reasoning is explicit rules and logic. It's very deterministic if you think back to some of our previous webinars. Think of it this way. If role does not equal manager and amount is greater than 500, then status equals rejected. Very rigid, very precise, very clear, very predictable. On the flip side of that coin is symbolic reasoning. This is where meaning is inferred from similarity and association and contact. It's very probabilistic. The equivalent of that previous rule might be something like, if this expense looks something like other expenses we've rejected, then reject it. Now, this all lives within vector databases and graph databases. Vector databases store numeric embeddings or representations which allow of topics, which allow AI to retrieve information by meaning rather than exact keyword match. And embedding really is it can be thought of in terms of like a graph, a GPS coordinate for meaning. If two things have a similar meaning, then their embedding vectors are similar. Graph databases, on the other hand, represent data as nodes and relationships, making it easy for model connections, making it easy for models to draw connections between people and events, assets, anything with relationships. So I've talked here a good deal about, I guess I've articulated some architectural diagrams, if you will, but let's step back and take a look at something that actually moves, something that actually works, something that actually gives real traction to some of these concepts.
Yeah, we'll do that. I do want to maybe touch on a couple of points here before we do. So first off, when we think about that unified storage platform conversation, I think it's important to understand that when we create these, we ought to create them for the right use case. And so it sort of used to be this concern that we should only have one data warehouse, or we should only have one data lake, and that's part of why data lake houses have evolved, is to say let's get something that's sourced from our back end stores, but is more like an operational data store, or a store that's designed and structured for use case. And so when we create that, we should think about a sort of enterprise architecture of having your fundamental stores sort of feeding into the store that's relevant for your use case. And then I think the other thing I wanted to talk about there, it's really interesting to think about streaming and event-driven systems. Kafka is a good example. There's actually a nice open source one called Fluvio that works pretty well too. And they're really good at providing multi-agent systems with a fabric for messaging and context and communicating. And so I think those type of streaming systems are becoming really important for any type of agentic workflows or multi-agent type of scenarios. And then lastly, I wanted to just mention, you talked about MCPs, and I think those are incredibly important because they represent a tool calling mechanism for language models, meaning that if a language model needs to know something or do something that it doesn't have an inherent capability to, you expose a tool. So if, for example, you're using Cursor or some other code gen tool and it needs to look at your file system, an LLM can't do that. So you expose a tool that can do that. And what's important about MCP and why it's so valuable is because it describes itself. It's declarative about what that tool does, and it uses actual narrative text or human readable text. It'll say, this tool allows you to explore the file system. right? And an LLM can understand in a reasoning mode, oh, if I need to get to the file system, I'm going to use this tool, right? And so you don't have to write declarative code to allow your agents to call tools. And that's the incredible power of an MCP, is this standardized structure that is meaningful for LLMs. Okay. Anything else, guys, before we hop over to the demo? Okay. So we're going to go ahead and this is my part of the show here. So I wanted to just sort of give an example of this. And so this is just a little tool that I whipped up. And I want to just give a quick shout out to some code here. So I don't expect anybody to read any of this, but the point is, I used Cursor, and again, we're not really advocating any particular one. I just happen to like Cursor, but I had Cursor build this thing in a couple of hours, and so it's got a Python backend that's just doing some connection to a language model, and it's got a little React front end to display it. And the point I wanted to make here is just that, for these type of use cases where you want to just explore something, this is incredibly valuable to be able to just say, here, can you create me a little UI that, explores this data? And, so this is something that we couldn't do in the past. We couldn't rapidly prototype like this. And so, if you're a reasonably technical person, you can add this to your arsenal and really have some power to explore your data and your AI use cases without having to make a huge investment in time. So with that said, what we're setting up here is a scenario of what information we're sending to a LLM and what we get back from it based on that. So that we have 3 different scenarios, and on the back end, this is calling to an Azure OpenAI model. I believe it's a GPT-4o. So it's a relatively sophisticated model. It's not, super new, but it's certainly very capable for any type of, basic reasoning inference that you might need. And so what we're going to do here is we have the same prompt that we're going to send to 3 different scenarios. So the first one, we're not going to send any data at all. We're just going to ask the question. The second one, we have a SQL data, but it's a bad schema, right? It's the column names are meaningless. The values don't have any sort of attribution or commentary or metadata to support them. There's no inherent sort of understanding of relationships between them. And it's entirely possible that your production systems, your line of business systems, have schemas like that are, really optimized for their use case, but not optimized for any type of data analytics or anything. And then we have here kind of a representation, a graph representation of this, so that we could say, okay, this is a customer, and their ID is Acme Corp, right? And then there's some metrics here. So we're putting some values to this. So support tickets last 30 days, 18, usage drop percentage last quarter, 42, et cetera, right? So we're giving some meaningful relationship that an LLM can get some inference from. So we'll go ahead and run these. And again, these are going to a live back end. So it'll take probably a minute or so for them to all load up. We should get the no data one back first. As this is loading up, I just want to say, obviously, this is a simplified use case, right? There's plenty of, I think most organizations have the sophistication to understand that their schema needs to be better than this if they want to get value out of it. But I think it's really dramatic, and it's important to understand. So as we look at the first one here, as a SaaS customer success assistant, I can provide some general reasons, right? But it has no information, right? So it's completely speculating. And it says it, right? I can't provide specific insights without access to internal data. So it gives some good sort of general information. but where's it getting that information from, right? And that's the real problem is we don't actually know, whether it's getting it from Wikipedia or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever source they scraped it from, Stack Overflow. We have no real knowledge, and in fact, it's not any one of those. It's really kind of all of them, right? And so this result is the sort of the conglomeration of all the different sources that talked about lack of product fit and how it affects customer churn. And we have no idea how accurate or relevant that is. Now, of course, it's a fairly general business case. So these are probably going to be right. But again, they're not relevant to your business. And just to sort of explore this for a second, the prompt that we gave it is really simple. You're a SaaS customer success assistant. The question, why might Acme Corp be at risk of churn? And this is important. You have no access to any internal customer data. Answer based only on general knowledge about SaaS churn. Be honest about what you don't know. And this is important because if you're not providing it with data, it will hallucinate. It will completely make up an entire corporation called Acme Corp and quarterly reports and everything. It will because it wants to be really helpful. And so if you have sparse data or your data is not well structured or anything, then you have to put some constraints in your prompting to make sure that it doesn't do that. And even doing this is not going to completely eliminate hallucinations. And the way that you reduce your risk of hallucinations is increasing the amount and quality of data that you give. So here, if we look at the SQL, the bad schema, now it says, well, I've got to make some educated guesses based on typical metrics that would be used, right? And so, guess is right that this is probably the customer, obviously, but here 18, this could represent the length of time Acme Corp has been a customer, but that's not true. We know it was support tickets last 30 days, right? And so it's completely speculating here. And if any of you are software developers or database developers, how bad column naming can be. It can be incredibly unintuitive. And, so one of the ways that can be addressed is through semantic modeling. So you might create, and I know, for example, Microsoft Fabric has the ability to, if you import a SQL database into there, it can create a semantic model that allows for more meaning and identification around your schema. But here, again, it's making some guesses, right? And this is absolutely useless information. It tells you nothing, but it's smart, right? In the sense that it's aligned with, if this is a health score, then this is a reasonable answer. And here, just to look at the prompt, you don't know the meaning of the column names, make a best effort interpretation, but be explicit where you are guessing. And so again, the prompting becomes really important. And this is a place where you could, for example, if you had an MCP, you could maybe provide more metadata, right? So if you had a reasoning model, you could say, call to this tool to get more information about the schema, right? And that would be a way that you could supplement. And the idea is to think about how can we make as much information and context available to the model as possible, and how can we constrain it with good prompting. And then lastly, of course, we've got the actual, a graph that we provided. And here, it's got some good answers, right? So Acme Corp has submitted 18 support tickets in the last 30 days. This could indicate that they are experiencing issues with the product, which, if unresolved, might lead to dissatisfaction, right? I mean, that's a good answer for that problem. And so for each one of these, it's got really good sort of understanding of the problem, right? There was an internal champion who likely advocated for the use of the product and facilitated its integration, left 62 days ago. The absence can lead to decreased product advocacy, et cetera, right? So this is really, good. And again, this is the exact same model that we're calling to. And here it even is able to give some actions to improve that. And if we look at the prompt here, very similar, right? But here we're telling what the context is and giving some information about what those metrics mean. And then just saying, use the context to explain churn risk and suggest concrete actions. So the better quality your data and the better your context around that data, the less work you have to do in prompt engineering to get it to stay within the guardrails and produce good information. And that's kind of the point here is when we're talking about making your data available for AI, this is the rub of it. If you don't want it to hallucinate, if you want it to have good information and be productive and useful, then make your data available, make it relevant, make it well structured and well labeled, and you will get so much value out of that. And I've said this before, but the value you get out of making your data available is far greater in the general case than the value you get out of fine-tuning a model. You know, for fine-tuning a model, you have to have an incredibly large amount of data. You have to have, frankly, a data scientist to structure that the right way and ensure that you have good training and validation sets. And there's risk of overfit. It's costly, and there are plenty of use cases for fine-tuning, but in the general case, making your data available and right is the best first step. If you get to a point where you need a model that's really, really good at understanding legal contracts or something, there might be an argument for fine tuning, but you start with this and then make that decision later. So yeah, so that was the demo. Again, I whipped this up pretty quickly. But Jeff and Murray, any thoughts, anything you want to bounce on about this?
You're stealing thunder here. There's so
Sorry.
many best practices that you're mentioning. We'll talk more about them here in a minute, but yeah, it's pretty indicative of best practices.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, then we will switch back over and you know, let Jeff talk a little bit about some of those patterns and practices.
Thanks. So yeah, let's zoom out and discuss the patterns, best practices that make these kinds of systems reliable. First off, we could talk about RAG, retrieval augmented generation. This is a popular pattern. It combines search results of your data with LLM's generative capabilities, and it is outstanding for turning documents and policies, knowledge, corporate knowledge that you already have into reliable answers, Chris just demonstrated. It also has a kind of a milestone place on the model adaptation spectrum. This is a continuum of ways to tailor a foundation model for your business, or maybe not tailor the foundation model, but the output of these foundational models for your business, progressing in cost and time and risk. We can start with prompt engineering. It's the cheapest instance, low risk way of shaping behavior. RAG is the next rung up. It's fast and low risk. And you add data to your search by adding your own data to search results instead of changing the model itself. Now, fine tuning ticks up from there, where we talk about retraining the model on business specific examples. So the model learns deeper patterns, more domain specific patterns. But the granddaddy of them all, the heavyweight option, is domain training, where we train or adapt the base LLM layers for more domain-specific expertise. Highest cost, slowest to implement, highest risk. And the rule of thumb here really is to use the lightest weight method that meets your accuracy needs. After all, if you could solve it with something like retrieval, then you shouldn't fine-tune or train models. Next up is centralization versus federation. This is organizations tend to manage data in two ways: centralization, that is to bring data together in one place, versus federation, which is keeping data distributed but making it accessible through shared standards and governance. Most companies, by the way, succeed with a hybrid model in the end. It's not a matter of choosing one end of the spectrum or another, but rather combining the two. So centralizing common shared data while federating domain-specific data, where local control matters is kind of a winning proposition. Now, as data becomes available, it also has to become more protected. Lean heavily on zero trust principles. Authenticate every request, encrypt everything in motion and at rest, and give access based on roles, not location or assumptions. And then there's metadata and cataloging. Metadata, I love it. Metadata is arguably the most underrated best practice there is, because it's not flashy, it's not urgent, and it's frequently owned by no one, and so that makes it a prime target for attention, because there's a lot of loopholes in the context which surround metadata and cataloging. However,
And
the importance of this is,
sorry, Jeff, I wanted to touch on that.
Yeah.
At its simplest, that metadata should cover provenance, meaning where did this data come from, and who's had control of it, right? Because that provenance can be really important in understanding the freshness and the relevance, and particularly for cases where you're looking for anomalies, right? If you're looking for fraud, you're looking for anomalous behavior, things like that. Having metadata about the provenance of that data is incredibly valuable. And that's a place where I think, a lot of times with application development, you're not always thinking about that layer. You're thinking about getting the application working. And so you don't necessarily have that provenance metadata baked into your line of business system. So you're going back to like the ETL and the ELT, introducing that metadata orthogonally through other systems can be a way to help you to get that and make it available.
Yeah, definitely giving metadata its due is important, because it's really the key to discoverable data, trustworthy metrics, reliable RAG. Poor metadata doesn't stop projects, but it slowly poisons them. So pay attention to metadata. Interoperability means using open standards like REST and Open API, and open formats like Parquet and Delta. So your data can move freely across clouds and tools and even teams. Now, not all data needs to be, not all data needs real-time processing or vector lookups. Balance the need for freshness and latency and cost by caching intelligently, batching what you can, and optimizing where it matters. Aim for fast enough, cheap enough, secure enough. That's usually a pretty good winning strategy. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but frankly, none of it matters much unless someone actually kind of leans forward and turns on the faucet. And for that, I'd like to turn it over to Murray now to discuss some practical next steps.
Again. Sorry,
okay.
Murray, I'm going to take your space here for 1 second because I can't stop talking. I do want to talk about a couple of things there. When we talk about that performance and cost awareness, there's a new sort of thing that we need to be considering, and that's token optimization. So generally speaking, when you're using an LLM, whether it's your own that you're running locally or one that you're using as a service, your cost is based on tokens in and tokens out, and that's just a proxy for the amount of content that is sent in and sent back out. And so we have a tendency to just toss everything into the prompt, and there's you may have heard of a term of context window, and that context window depends on the model. Some have 100K, some have 200K, some have 20K, and you have to be mindful of that, because that's the the entire scope of data that an LLM can handle within a single prompt. And so it starts to matter when you're trying to provide relevant data to an LLM that you token optimize that data. That might mean, again, in that sort of ELT stage, compacting that data, reducing unimportant words, unnecessary text, unnecessary data, and just limiting it to what really matters. So I think that's just an important point I wanted to call out, is when we're thinking about that performance and cost, we really have to think about our token usage and what that LLM cost becomes. So with that, I will hand it over to Murray to talk more about some practical applications. And you're on mute, Murray.
I wanted to make sure I wasn't providing unnecessary feedback, and I forgot I was on mute because I was talking away and babbling to myself. You know, one of the things when I listen to Chris and Jeff talk, there's an awful lot of information that they're providing. And, you know, when I think about wearing the project manager hat, I start taking down tasks and trying to identify what I want to do and when I want to do it. And to some degree, it can feel a bit overwhelming that there's a lot to do, but in reality, the most important thing to do is to start, not necessarily have the big plan, have the big rollout, do everything at once. You're going to learn so much more by just doing things and getting involved. So we don't recommend the big bang approach at all here. We recommend really iterating through this. Number one, identifying the data that you believe drives the most value, right? Within your corporation, you have a tremendous amount of data, some of it structured, some of it not structured, all the things that Chris and Jeff talked about. But just start with something. And in reality, you know, in a 90-minute meeting, get started with IT, find somebody from the business, and just roll up the sleeves and get started. Again, you're just going to learn so much from that exercise. Again, starting with pick out one high impact data silo, one area where you know the data is constrained, it lives independently, and start to really take that apart. Put together the security, obviously, that Chris mentioned, put in a lightweight integration, some type of API, and all of a sudden now you start to unlock additional workflows downstream that can be beneficial. So start with one and get going. And then we talked about security. Again, I don't think we have to reinvent a complete security model, but come up with some really simple business-friendly access controls that can be easily implemented and will help you reduce friction by getting people access without being overly cumbersome. Finally, pick your first use case, right? What is a problem not only that's important for you to solve, but one that is not necessarily going to be the hardest one to solve, because you need to show value. So pick something that's important. Also pick something that's doable within a time frame. Choose a problem, define a metric, and then really build around that. So small steps are going to dramatically reduce overall time. Small steps give you value that you can prove to the business. Those small steps then allow you to build bigger steps later.
You know, I want to just touch on, you know, you talked about metrics, and I think that's a place where we tend to fall down organizationally. Is we want to do something, we know we have a problem, we think AI can solve it, and so we go ahead and build something to solve it, but we don't necessarily identify the actual metrics that would be useful. And that's of course going to be very different for every use case. You know, if you want to improve your net promoter score, for your customer service, that's a metric that you have to bake in and try to correlate if you want to, try it to something like reduced call volume, or you want to increase your sales. Some of those are easier to correlate than others, because you have to isolate potentially other variables. But that is really important, because when it's a simple proof of concept, and you spent whatever $50,000 to build it, or some relatively small amount of money, and you think you've got success, then it's easy to just jump to, okay, let's do a much bigger push, a bigger implementation. But if you haven't really nailed down what that actual value is that you're getting out of it, you might be misinterpreting your results, and then your ROI is completely off. So I think that measurable part is incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree. I like the term of start at the end. Envision what goals you want to achieve. Envision the types of things that you want to either improve, and then work backwards on how do I get there. And then that can help drive the decisions you make in terms of what things you want to start with, and where you want to build, and make your investments, because they are investments, right? And we're trying to achieve those business outcomes. So start at the end, and then kind of from that, then go back to the beginning and figure out how you want to achieve those goals.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. If you wouldn't go into the next slide.
Sure.
All righty. So one of the things that we think is important is not only having the systems in place, but if you have the ability to start kind of monitoring who's accessing what data. One of the things that I think you'll find is that you'll be surprised once you open up these channels of information, as it were. You start to get visibility into who's actually using them. And this, I think, really will help leadership understand where availability may be breaking down, or where you may be surprised at, once you open it up, who's using it. Those are the type of people where you may be surprised at who's using it, where you're going to get the most value for what you want to do next. Again, not doing the big bang all at once, but opening up opportunities for the business to use your data, and then seeing who's using it and how they're using it can help you form kind of step 2, step 3, step 4. So in terms of availability, we've talked a lot about making it available. I think it's good to have some type of checklist, or some type of metrics in terms of availability. Is the data discoverable? Is it accessible? Is it governed? Is it explainable? And is it secure? All the things that we kind of referenced in terms of what you want to do and the tools and techniques, but starting off with a checklist, because you're not going to get it all at once, but knowing for each little project that you go, each incremental effort, how much more are you opening up? How much more are you making it accessible? How much more are you making it governed and secure, and so on like that? I think that helps you from getting blocked early on in terms of knowing what you want to accomplish, and then helping you give a roadmap for each project, not only introducing a little bit more capabilities to the organization, but also putting in place those things you need to make sure really are governed and appropriately set up for your organization. Next item, I always kind of like to think in terms of products, and I think the data sets themselves can be thought of as products. I think it makes it easier to make the data available to AI. I also think it makes it easier to help you kind of scope out how you want to approach the development and delivery of the capabilities you're going to give to the organization. And finally, as you get more sophisticated, when you start putting in agentic workflows, starting to build out additional APIs. You don't need agents right away, but I think it's important to keep that in the back of your mind, that you do want to build these things in place. So you want to put together your architecture and your infrastructure that will support the future development of different agentic workflows, different APIs that you want to build. So you can start to have in the future, being able to pull data dynamically and getting that set up so that it can feed on itself. And finally, momentum matters. Make sure that you can celebrate the wins as they occur, starting small and building on it. Not only talking about what you want to do, but also talking about what you have done and what you've learned. It may not be a perfect product A solution that comes out the door right away, but you've got something out the door and you've learned from that. So celebrate that and celebrate that not only within kind of the product team, but also with management. Management needs to know that you are making this progress and you are doing these things to achieve these goals. And here's what we did, and here's what the result was, and here's what we learned from that. The small steps, I think they add up fast and get you that momentum you need to carry these projects forward. So that's kind of to some degree, I think the term is Captain Obvious types of statements, but I think it's good to have those in the back of your mind and knowing not only what you're trying to do, but how you're going to communicate that, how you're going to celebrate that, and what you're going to build on. That momentum is really important.
I like that idea of celebrating. I think there's this we have this dichotomy of fear and optimism about AI, right? It's going to solve every problem for the business. And, of course, that means you need less people. So all those other people are going to get fired, right? Or laid off and replaced by AI. And I don't think either of those are true. And so when we think about that, to me at least, the goal isn't to reduce headcount by replacing it with AI. The goal is to let AI take care of those things that it's good at to allow your resources, your human resources, to do the things that they're good at, right? And that's really the key there, is to let your resources work to their best and highest. And for example, we're working with an organization right now to do some content generation, and I think there's a lot of fear around that because we're seeing commercials that are completely generated by AI, or marketing content. But the reality is that it's not good enough. It's very clearly AI generated, and it doesn't have the frankly human touch that human generated content does. And so the value there is, let the agent generate V1, right? Let it take your source data, let it correlate, let it find good information, let it use your voice and help frame things. And then you bring, as the content manager, as the person with the vision, you bring the quality to it, the polish, the human touch and orientation. And so whatever that thing is that you're trying to do with AI, I think that celebration is that it has helped your your employees or your peers focus on the things that are most valuable as their to their job, instead of being stuck in minutia and little things.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris, you make about letting the AI do what it's best at and letting the humans do what they're best at. And sometimes those can be very discrete differences, and sometimes there's the partnership aspect of both the human and the AI solving a problem better and faster than just one can by themselves, whether it's just the AI or just the human. So I think you draw a good point there that it does become a partnership, and it's not necessarily an either or.
It also provides I think, a pretty valuable feedback mechanism back into the whole process, where the reward of the success, the celebration, can be reinforced back into the process to ultimately reproduce that same positive celebratory result back into future endeavors, streams, however you want to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, it can be a virtuous cycle, and that's, what we want to go for. Okay, so key takeaways, just as a recap, data availability is about plumbing, not just storage. The right technologies and the right practices will unlock AI value and start with small, high impact availability use cases. I think those are fairly obvious. So I will, claim the Captain Obvious title here, but they're important, and they should be your touchstones in anything that you're doing. So with that, I think we have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which might be a first. I think this is the first time we've had extra time for Q&A.
Yeah, usually we're keeping everyone shackled to us for a few extra minutes to try and cover everyone's questions. But the first question from the audience is, what risks arise if availability is missing, and how do we quantify that impact?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question, and I think about risk a lot. And I think any type of investment in technology, you should be thinking about risk a lot. And of course, AI introduces all new risks that we have to be concerned about. I think that how you measure it depends a lot on the type of risk. So I always go back to the Air Canada sort of debacle where they had a AI agent that gave away a discount that it didn't exist, right? And so that went all the way through the Canadian court system, and they were ruled against. And this is really important because that risk is, you have to think about the practical implications of the failures, right? So again, if it's a chat bot that is, recommending certain clothing, a red shirt versus a blue, it doesn't matter that much, right? The risk is fairly low, and the quantification of that as a business might be that you sold more of one product than another, or that you might maybe not have as many customers, or your net promoter score might go down. But you have to find what is a realistic sort of measurement for that. On the other hand, if the things you're doing have more material impact on people's lives, right? They're involving financial decisions, or they're medical decisions, or the system is controlling physical machines in such a way that there's risk to life and property. Those risks are so much higher, and all of that is about the quality of your data that's driving the decisions that the AI makes. And so, getting it back to the data question, if you don't have good data, your AI can't make good decisions. It simply can't. And so, it comes back to what's the use case, what are the potential risks, and then you have to try to put some dollars around it, or some meaning around it, to say, okay, if it fails in this way, we're exposing ourselves to a lawsuit, or if it fails this way, we have to give somebody a 20% discount on a product, right? I mean, think about, right size it to the problem, and try to come up with a good measure for it.
I think there's also another implication that occurs when availability is missing that I think needs to get called out, and that is the rise or growing dependency on tribal knowledge. I don't think that I've ever entered into a client project without seeing some form of tribal knowledge at play. Sometimes it's robust, sometimes and pretty mature, actually. Other times it's in its infancy and evolves over time. But regardless, it's always there. And when availability is missing, one of the risks is a growing dependency on that tribal knowledge. The presence of it gives rise to the presence of the human API, and when those humans go away, which inevitably we do, there's a single point of failure that's just waiting to happen. And so keeping that availability high and on the list of importance of places that deserve some attention, I think would behoove everyone.
Perfect. Our next submitted question is, how do we avoid vendor lock-in when adopting lakehouses, vector databases, iPaaS platforms, etc.?
That is a great question. You wanna start, Jeff or
Oh,
Murray?
yeah, open standards, open formats is the name of the game. It increases not only modularity, but prevents when you're working towards standards, you're not dependent on independent implementations. Think of your the outlets in your wall. They all conform to a standard. Imagine uh, the grief that we as homeowners, as renters, homeowners, everyone living in a domicile would experience if every vendor of a lamp required a different format, different orientation of a plug. It would be chaos, and you'd be locked into a vendor manufacturer ABC for their particular lamp because that's what works in your wall. It's
I have that
openness
problem
and
with all my
standards is the
power
name.
tools. I have
Right.
right now. Like you either have to
The,
pick
the,
right DeWalt or Milwaukee or Makita or something, and you're locked into that. So
the battery interface. Yep, no doubt.
right. I think it's I'm not sure you can avoid that. And the point there is that at the enterprise level, the investments that you're making are so significant that it drives you towards platforms that kind of do everything. And I'm saying that not for a couple of examples, and not to speak in any way negatively about them. Like Fabric is becoming a one-stop shop, right? And Azure, Foundry is like all your AI is here. And similarly, like Snowflake will kind of do everything for you. And I'm not calling out whether they're good or not, but the risk there is that you are heavily invested in a platform, and then you're sort of bound to its release cycle and its own, qualities and deficiencies. And so I think that, to Jeff's point, that open standards, if your framework, if the glue and services that are supported by those bigger systems are open standards, then it's easier to swap those out if it becomes a problem. It's easier to introduce a new graph database technology if you have a quality sort of ETL and governance layer sitting in between it and an MCP, right? And so that standards part becomes where you get that interoperability and swappability.
Perfect. Our third question submitted is, what governance model should be considered to ensure sensitive data is protected while still enabling AI innovation?
I wanted to say something really pithy here, but if it ain't got it, it can't say it. That's what it comes down to. It's like, if you don't want something exfiltrated, don't make it available. That is the simplest way to put it. And I say that because governance can be costly, and it can be exhaustive, and it can be a lot of overhead, and for good reason, right? Your data governance, it's your most important asset in most organizations, right? And so the governance of that is really important, but it can be boiled down to really simple, like first principles, right? Only make the data available that you need. Whether that means limiting the scope of it or redacting data, limiting what fields are made available. That's the first piece before you talk about any sort of formalized structure. But then you start getting into concerns around access rights and roles. So let's just say, for example, you're using Copilot 365, right? Without something like Purview, you're kind of going to be in a lot of trouble as far as what it has access to, because I have not met an organization yet that had a good sort of security posture around their SharePoint environment. You start out with a really good plan for it, and then it just all, people use it, and people start sharing things in places they shouldn't. And all of that becomes a problem when, you have vector systems that can index all of that, right? So the things like data protection, labeling, sensitivity labeling, strong access controls, and ultimately those walled gardens, I think, become the best way to do that.
Perfect. Well, I know we're here at the top of the hour, so we'll have to send the response to our last question out to the audience. But with that, that concludes our part 3 of our fall/winter webinar series on AI. And we look forward to kicking off our 2026 series again in the new year. We'll be taking on topics and deep diving into everything from prompt engineering, RAG, and reasoning patterns in early 2026. But with that, definitely would love to connect if you have additional questions or you would like to connect with our team and Chris's practice. And if we don't hear from you before that, then happy holidays and a happy new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.